Alrighty. Hey everyone. I'm very excited about this seminar. So thanks for joining today. We're going to dive into one of Dewey's data partners, Veraset. We've been working with them for a while now, and I actually, even previous to Dewey, have been working closely with this team for a while. So this is one of my favorite data vendors I've worked with. They have some incredible data sets, which we're going to go deep on today and talk about. Some data sets that are included with Dewey subscriptions, and then others they'll probably touch on that are actually not available on Dewey, but are worth touching a little bit here as well. But for the most part, we're going to focus on their visits data set, which is included on a Dewey institutional subscription. Some quick kind of housekeeping things before we jump in. I didn't really introduce myself, but I'm Evan. I'm the CEO and founder of Dewey. We've been working on this, Dewey platform for about 3 years now. And as you know, we're really here to kind of unlock data sets for academic use. So we partner with a bunch of companies similar to Veraset in a bunch of different industries to make their data sets available for academic research purposes. And we're always kind of trying to find the newest and latest and best partners in each different category to bring onto the platform. And Veraset's one of those great examples of a partner who really has a great mobility product, which we'll dive into in a second. Generally, this really quickly on this seminar, it's going to be recorded, so you don't have to frantically take notes. We'll definitely share a recording with anyone who's registered afterwards. Feel free to pass that along to others who you might think this is relevant for. And I'll say this Q&A thing works way better if you kind of participate along the way. Don't hesitate to ask questions while we're going through this. We will pause, we'll answer the questions as they're relevant versus handling them all at the end. I think it's better just to have it be more of a natural flowing conversation. And so there is a Q&A feature where you can ask questions. I think there might even be a chat feature as well, but the Q&A feature is best just so we can kind of surface common questions as well. And then obviously at the end, we will follow up probably with a direct link or kind of email here or whatever is best to connect with the Veraset team, but we're always happy to connect you with that team if you are interested in talking with them directly. If you're on this call, you've probably talked with someone or know someone directly on the Dewey team who you can always ask for an introduction to. Really quickly too, as you know, on the Dewey platform, we always provide detailed documentation of each of our partners. And so if you want to kind of follow along and learn more, we do have a documentation site built out specifically focused on the visits product, which again, we're going to go into more detail on now, but you can always learn more on our documentation page. And then quickly, we've hinted about this in a couple emails that are coming up, but we're doing a big product rollout next Monday. There's going to be a bunch of new features to make it even easier to search and discover and download data sets, some custom querying and filtering on the data to make it easier to kind of filter down just to the data you need. And so we are launching this next week, so be on the lookout for that. And we're going to do another seminar to talk through some of those updates. I think Kelly's going to share a link now in the chat if you want to check that out. So with that, I will stop talking and stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to hand it over to the Veraset team to kind of introduce themselves and talk about the visits product.
All right, thanks, Evan. Am I coming through clearly?
Yep.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. Welcome to today's session on Veraset Visits, Device-Level Visits Attribution at Scale. My name is Adam Fatchler. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Veraset, and I'm also a passionate user of the Visits dataset myself. I'm joined by an exceptional set of colleagues. We've got Pete Mickarts, our Director of Business Development and Supply, Danica Hill, the Senior Manager of Customer Success, and Justin Leopold, the Strategic Account Manager who handles all of our EDU accounts with excellence. But before we dive into the product mechanics, I wanted to start with something a little more tangible. As I mentioned, I actually do use visits very regularly to create industry-facing content. So caveat emptor, there is not peer-reviewed research here, but what we've found is that the data that we pull often corroborates what we're seeing play out in the real world, whether it's in earnings reports or headlines or just on shifts on the ground. So on the left here, when McDonald's was going through the wake of an E. coli outbreak earlier this year, our foot traffic data was able to show how they were losing market share to some of their competitors, and that actually was exactly what their earnings report revealed. On the right there, we did a cross-shopping analysis of Whole Foods shoppers, and we wanted to see where else did they grocery shop and for how long. And what we discovered was that when someone was a Whole Foods shopper, they spent a whole lot more time at Whole Foods compared to some other grocery stores. The famous resolution rebound that happens every January with fitness clubs Do people really start going to the gym and then do they really drop off? Our data was able to show that some of these brands were actually able to sustain the trend, sustain the momentum well into quarter 1, which just again goes against conventional wisdom, which is something that foot traffic data can sometimes corroborate with. And on the right there, you've got three popular Tex-Mex brands, and you see the distribution of their dwell time, and they're all targeting different kinds of customer experiences. And so it's interesting to see it visualized. I'm showing you all that stuff just to unlock a little bit of value and create a little bit of curiosity. But what I really want you to keep in mind as we go through this is, what research would you fast track tomorrow if you had reliable insight into where people visited? Because on the face of it, where did someone go seems relatively straightforward, but the truth is that visitation attribution is hard. Location data is noisy, attribution is messy, and many have tried to solve it with mixed results. Veraset Visits is our solution, and we're here today to show you what it looks like and what it can unlock for you. So, to fully appreciate it, I just want to take one step back to define the foundation. Whenever you enable location services on an app, whether you're talking about precise location or approximate, it generates pings. And these are time-stamped coordinates from a mobile device signaling where it was in that moment. That's location data, it's the raw signal. But on its own, it's just that, a signal. And the power comes when you combine it with point of interest context. So this location data, which is again coming from a mobile device with consent on an opportunistic basis, that means that we're not getting a constant all the time feed of someone's location. It's just in these moments where the app is requesting it. What we then do is we take that raw signal and we layer on top of it information about points of interest. And you can think of that as any type of place that can be classified. Restaurants, retail stores, gas stations and convenience, travel hubs, tourist attractions. If it shows up on Google Maps, we probably cover it. And of course, there are a few POI, point of interest categories, especially sensitive ones that we exclude for privacy reasons. We'll get into that later. But then what you can do when you've got a little bit of business information overlaid with our clustered pings is that you can unlock time series analysis of visitation trends. You can attribute ad exposure to foot traffic. Think, you can validate, did someone see this billboard and then visit a nearby store? You can analyze cross visitation across different categories and subcategories, different regions, all the way down to zip code. And then you can compare those dwell times, how much time people actually spent, again, across all these categories, which enables quite a bit of competitive intelligence. Now, what I just showed you is what visits can enable and surface. And let's take a step back and talk about how this data is actually created. Because what makes visits so useful and so unique is the rigor of its methodology. We're not just guessing if someone was near a store, we're applying strict criteria to determine if someone actually visited a point of interest using time, velocity, and dwell time analysis layered over these POI polygons. So before we show you the actual structure of the data set, the schema, and the fields that you'd be working with through Dewey, I just want to walk you through how a visit gets made. All right, so first, we're going to cleanse the raw movement data. So we start with those raw GPS pings, but not all pings are created equal. First, we remove any rows with problematic lat-long coordinates, high horizontal inaccuracy, jumpy movements, sinks, any anomaly that would compromise the overall data quality. We then cluster the GPS signals using the dbScan algorithm, and we do that based on proximity and time. And this basically helps us isolate meaningful patterns. It's essentially a grouping together of pings that likely represent a stay at a location corroborated by multiple devices. What we then do is we overlay those point of interest polygons, those real world places with the business context embedded. And this lets us identify which places a device may have visited. It effectively generates for us a short list of potential visits. We then run a ranking algorithm, which has been trained on social media check-in data to determine which potential point of interest is the most likely winner for that visit event. And we use a learning to rank model similar to the technology used to power Google search that learns how to rank a set of nearby places by comparing the feature vectors for those places, like open hours, the type of establishment, and a few other additional criteria. Finally, we generate the daily feed, which is a structured output of confirmed visit events that's ready for downstream analysis. So rather than treating every ping like a visit or relying on something simplistic like a strict dwell time threshold, this process ensures that every visit in our feed is the result of a robust, multi-step process, and that with this context in place, I'd like to hand it over to Pete, who can walk us through the schema, what you'll actually receive in the visits data set, and how to make the most sense of all of our columns.
Awesome. Thank you, Adam. I appreciate it. So when diving into visits, what does it actually look like? Quite literally, this is it. So we'll get into the schema in a second here, but this is actually real data. Obviously with a little blockhead over the ID column for the individual devices. But ultimately, you'll see the individual device ID, which is persistent and unique for every device. So a device from 4 months ago should have the same device ID as it does this month. The date of the actual visit, the timestamp, the local timestamp. So obviously I'm on the West Coast, East Coast, different time. The ID type, whether it's an iOS or Android, the location name. So not only Speedway, Shake Shack, all of the major chain stores. But we also have a lot of mom and pop shops. It's one thing that our POI data set from SafeGraph provides is a lot of individual single location kind of mom and pop type locations. The category of which it is in, as well as a subcategory. Keep in mind that each one of these you can filter on. So if you only want to filter on gas stations or grocery stores or department stores or ice cream shops, for instance, you can filter down by the top category as well as a subcategory based on the category, based on the geography, based on the time, the day, all these given things to really have this unique output or cohort that you're looking to work with. Now, in the bottom section here, it gets into the actual POI data. So what is the street address of this gas station? What is the city, state, and zip? The geohash 5, which is roughly 3 miles. I think it's 3.1 miles by 3.1 miles as far as a geo. The census block group, the NAICS code, which is associated with the brand, if relevant. The minimum dwell time, which is the first ping and the last ping seen inside of these POI, these wickets. Danica will get into some, the minimum dwell time being 0.0 for single ping visits in a few minutes, as well as the place key. The place key can provide even more information on this given POI, hours of operation, how long they've been open. You can take a look at the historical of this given POI as well. Maybe it's an ice cream shop today, but 5 years ago was a fried chicken joint, right? Whatever it may be. So you can take a look at the historical aspect of that individual POI as well. Kind of a review here. So quick visit schema. Of course, we can provide this. It's also on our website. Add ID, timestamp, all the exact same data, just in a nice clean format here that you'd see on the visit side from visits as well as the POI. Yep. So getting into the schema for home and work. So the home schema, think of it as just the same, except it's calculated a little bit differently. So for home, we actually take a look at 6 weeks of previous data from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. and cluster pings at a given location to say or infer that, yes, this is someone's home location, right? So 6 weeks of historical data rolling into the monthly deliverable of home or work. So when the data is delivered, you still have the same exact ID. So you can take a look at, okay, this person, lives in this given area, census block group or geohash 5, where do they shop? Oftentimes, researchers will use home and work products to understand where do people originate their shopping experiences or their trips from, right? A lot of times, for instance, obviously I work from home. I have to go out to Target on the other side of town and come back, right? A lot of folks choose to do their shopping on the way home or the way to work. So you can understand that maybe there's a lot of visits in San Jose. I live in Gilroy, California. San Jose is about half an hour north. Maybe I do a lot of my shopping if I had to work up there every day, or a lot of my lunch or dinners are going to be up north. You can really get a sense of DMA traffic and where people frequent based on their home and work locations. So the ID type, the geohash of this home location, obviously the country code, the county, the region, city, state, zip, as well as a census block group for the home location. And the same is exact thing on the work side. So taking a look at the work side of things, it's 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. We're clustering pings over a 6-week rolling window, and this is delivered on a monthly basis as well. So same exact process. And if we can't infer that this is most likely a home or work location, then we would not include that device in the panel. So as far as the research that's been done with Veraset data.
Sorry, Pete, you mind? I just want to make sure we're asking some of these questions as they're relevant to what was presented. Adam, I actually might jump back to you quickly. We had one question come up around the visit attribution. I think this was from Martin asking around any kind of academic publications on that visit attribution process. I think I've seen like a visit attribution white paper you've potentially published. Do you have any kind of material or docs you guys can share related to how you do that visit attribution? I think
you're on mute, Adam.
Yeah, you might be on mute.
We can definitely send out to all participants links to our technical documentation on how that algorithm works.
Perfect. And then I know I'm maybe jumping ahead. But I do see a bunch of questions on coverage, so I want to make sure we kind of can touch that on a high level basis, maybe, and if we can go into detail. But a lot of people are asking around like coverage. Is it US only? Is it within the US? What's the coverage like in terms of like the number of census block groups, et cetera? Or like, I guess not number of census block groups, but percentage coverage, things like that.
Great question. It should cover the entire US. Now, whether that's 100% of the census block groups, I wouldn't dare to make that claim, but I would assume so. It should be correct.
Cool. And then I think just I'll save some of these for the end or later, but relevant to your comment around the POIs, just to confirm, you said there was a place key, so I imagine that the actual POI data is sourced from SafeGraph?
Correct. Yes. And it's updated, refreshed on a monthly basis.
Cool. And then you mentioned how home locations are based on a rolling 6 weeks. So how often are they changed? So we would, it's based on rolling 6 weeks, but presumably they would quote unquote change in the next month, in every monthly delivery. They're subject to change based on the previous 6 weeks.
Correct. Exactly. So for instance, I actually looked at my own device, right? I just moved from Maine to California. I moved back. I got to California, for instance, about mid-February. By March, that deliverable, my device had changed to California.
Cool.
So even though it's the most recent, basically they took a month of data. So the last 4 weeks, they basically lopped off the previous most historic 2 weeks, and they identified that I was here.
Perfect. And then last question before we'll let you continue. We'll save some of the other ones, but related to schema changes. I know there was a time when home and work were kind of included in the visits, and then they were then broken out. I think post 2022. Can you just kind of like elaborate on what happened there?
Yeah, that's a good question. Danica, do we have a good sense of that? Or I think we should probably just follow up with the timeline and kind of the change log that we can follow up with in the group email thereafter.
Yeah, we can. I think
easiest.
Come out just to make sure that visits to POI known locations weren't being bucketed in like home or work locations, more of a semantics thing than it is anything else.
Cool. I know on the Dewey listing, at least, I think we basically had to separate it into 2 files because the home and work was then broken out. So I think like from our delivery point of view, home and work technically start as their own standalone products. Home and work visits, I should say, are standalone products, I think post 2022, but we can also confirm. Very good. All right, I'll save the rest for now. You guys can keep going.
So a lot of the research that's been done, we got 3 different options here, 3 different references here from Wiley, Sandia, and Nature. I have personally worked with the World Bank for the last 3 years at Veraset, as well as most recently United Nations, which will be on the Quality of Life Index on a global scale with them. But Wiley publication using mobile device to evaluate access to essential services, natural hazards. Our data was used a ton by whether it's the US government or German Cancer Research, for instance, studying outside sun exposure to cancer diagnosis, right? Sandia Lab, excuse me, limitations on cell phone mobility for disaster recovery, COVID recovery, migration patterns. Obviously, mobility data is heavily used for a lot of these research topics. And of course, mobility networks in greater Mexico City. So a lot of, whether it's DPAN or mobility networks, cellular networks, leverage our data to understand high and low spots in coverage, whether they use the data to continuously improve their own network, that some of the cellular networks we all know and love here in the States use our data, or various networks outside of the US as well. From use cases outside of our prototypical kind of research, right? Out of home and attribution is one of our core kind of major cornerstone use cases for our entire customer profile. So if an ad is served on a mobile device, or for instance, Clear Channel posts an ad on a billboard going down 101, as we all know in San Francisco, all the latest tech companies have all their billboards up, right? Did they actually go to the website? Did they go to the physical store in this instance? After going by that billboard, did they visit Sephora if Sephora had a billboard, right? And the timestamp between those two, actually seeing the device go by that billboard versus actually attributing the visit in store, is obviously the measurement aspect of that thing, of that use case. Planning, public infrastructure. Obviously, cities are growing, understanding where people are going, not only to specific parts of a city in an aggregate view, but also where are people going to specific parts of the city to eat, to shop, to get their clothes washed, whatever it may be, based on those categories and subcategories for planning and travel infrastructure especially. And of course, retail, right? Understanding who your audience is. Where are they coming from? How long are they traveling to get to your destination or your shop? Where else do they shop if they frequent yours? So cross-shopping analysis is a huge use case to understand, okay, with target shoppers, where else do they shop? And should those stores be, included in this strip mall if Target is going to open a cornerstone location, right? So understanding a lot of these things and use cases is incredibly relevant to not only these major brands, but also researchers in general. Now, a question we get quite often, almost every day, is what is the difference between movement and visits? So movement is the raw ping data that Adam had talked about earlier. Think about 12 billion pings produced across the globe on a daily basis. All of those pings are movement, right? Deduplicated, slightly cleansed. They're lat-long coordinates, they're deterministic. There's no dwell time. It's just a point in time, lat-long, with a timestamp associated with an ID. Visits is, of course, attributing these devices to specific places or POI at a given time on a given date. So movement is the flour that makes the pancakes that is visits, right? So it's an ingredient to visits. At the same time, this raw movement data, of course, is incredibly valuable as well to a lot of researchers like yourselves. A lot of research oftentimes will buy both along with home and work, or procure both along with home and work. So we have the both available. Both are unique in their own way. But think of movement as this raw underlying data that fuels visits. Now, passing it to Danica to get into some NAICS code filtering and why and how we do it.
Yeah, thank you, Pete. I want to take a moment to acknowledge, I know there's still a few questions lingering in the chat. Hopefully I address some of those as I talk through some points here. Evan and Kelly were both great to send over some of these prior to the webinar. So I'll run through a few common limitations or anomalies you may find within the data, and then we'll get back to your guys' questions and hopefully make sure you have the information you need. If not, the team at Dewey and I work incredibly closely together. They can make sure that we connect and get you guys clarification on anything that we're not able to touch on. So a couple of limitations. Before I dive into this, I just want to say that I appreciate everyone joining. Veraset has worked closely with, some large scale academic organizations, and we really are excited about this partnership with Dewey. It's really interesting to be able to read the publications that come out about this. So even with some known limitations or anomalies, this data really has proven to be incredibly valuable across the board. Privacy being one of them. Initially, knowing that Dewey has access to a large timeline of our data, 2019 to current state, I want to point out there's two kind of pieces to this part. Since 2022, Veraset has been filtering out via the NAICS code assignment religious organizations and institutions in our visits data set. It's cross-referenced between the POI and then known NAICS codes. The asterisks meaning it can be any kind of variable after that point that fall onto those. So 2022 forward is when we started doing religious organizations. This is really just based off of regulatory focus, privacy concerns. And then in 2024, we doubled down based off of, it really stemmed from the overturn of Roe v. Wade and a lot of focus kind of snowballing at that point with the FTC for data brokers, sensitive locations, and privacy practices. The ones we added are everything under religious organizations. So I'll run through a few examples here. Religious organizations, obviously churches, faith-based community centers, right? The next one being the justice row is going to be police stations, firehouses, courthouses, prisons. Social Security, Veteran Affairs, and unemployment offices would be underneath the Administration of Human Resources. Elementary and secondary schools, they think, are pretty straightforward, but you would also include like district offices in that case. For those younger kiddos, anyone under the age of 16, we do not allow that data within our data set. Labor unions, and one of the biggest points of sensitivity is going to be your social advocacy groups. So think your LGBTQIA centers, Planned Parenthood, ACLU offices, so on and so forth. Those are removed at ingest and that you will not see them within the Veraset's visits data set. If you have any further questions or concerns, or do see any of those within the data set, please reach out to Dewey and they can connect you to us and we can have a further conversation. Okay, so these were a couple of the questions, comments, concerns floated over previously when we were talking about doing this webinar. I know there was a question about the percentage of the population that we cover, and we don't have an estimate of that, unfortunately, just because it can shift from, you know, day to day or month to month. But I'm sure that there's some volume measurement we can come up with and follow up with after the fact to try and quantify that for you. The first one being, is this a census of every device? Is this perfectly reliable? Going back to Adam's point, the data is opportunistic. It's an active foreground use consented by the user. I think that's incredibly important to keep in mind. I also want to note that there was a shift in that behavior. So in the earlier years of that visits data set, let's say 2019 to 2020 through 2020, applications were actually in much higher volume collecting background data. So you'll see the density in that time frame maybe be a little bit more denser. After the fact, the data is still dense, is still valuable, but it goes to that opportunistic foreground collection. Sometimes when you're looking at finite events and you expect there to be a large spike, that can kind of throw it off for that type of use case. The second one being, 0-second dwell time or single ping visits. They're garbage, we should throw them out. It's not necessarily true. We previously did have a higher dwell time and required multiple pings for a visit attribution. And then COVID hit and the world changes, and we needed to change the way that we are presenting the visits data within that data set. So we spent a couple of months really doubling down and making sure that our visits algorithm was reflective of those real world COVID changes. So previously curbside pickup and those quick visits, you're running in to grab a power tool from Home Depot. You would go into the store, you would shop, you would be there multiple times. I'm on my app. Home Depot tells you what aisle the tool's on, so you don't have to talk to anyone. It's great. Now I'm in there and I'm out so quick because I've ordered, I've paid. I might check my phone once. So that's going to be, you know, a 3-second dwell time maybe, or a single ping. And we still feel confident in attributing that. I do know that there was a question or a concern about negative dwell times. I have our product team taking a look into that right now. I didn't see any based off of just a quick gut check, but we want to look into that for you. It's my hope that that is an incredibly minuscule anomaly within the data, and we'll get you guys some more information there. And then we have, like Pete said, a wide variety of use cases for location data. The obvious one, a large gas station chain uses Veraset visits to do site selection. That's really exciting. But we also have a handful of other visitation data users that are putting out publications, and we can try and aggregate a list of that for you. Pete mentioned 3 or 4 of them earlier. One of my favorite ones that is just getting kicked off is a researcher in the Midwest who's trying to utilize several data sets to track infectious pathogens between humans and deer. Mostly focused on the COVID-19 or a variation of that. But I'm really excited to see kind of how they're able to join data sets, use visits, use movement, and bring that to hopefully a publication stage. Next slide. There was also a question about work from home. So this goes back to adjusting how our visits product sees the world after COVID because it was such a stark difference. And we did add a work from home feature. I believe Pete outlined the 2 dwell times for work and then for home. And essentially, if your dwell times are consistent for both of those, and we recognize that you're at the same location dwelling for those hours at work, and you're at the same location dwelling at those hours for home, then it would be considered, you would be flagged as a 1, as you're an individual who works from home. And you can imagine a handful of ways that would be important, whether it's advertising or, human behavior trend post-COVID, isolation. Maybe you're working that work from home flag into some type of isolation or behavioral analysis paired with other data. So there's a lot of really fun ways that you can kind of leverage that and see how that would work in benefit of your research. There was one other question I don't believe we have a slide on, and I think I saw it in the chat about device flipping from an iOS to an Android. That too should be a minuscule amount, like a half of a percent. We recently found that anomaly within the data set. What I believe is happening there, and I'll confirm, is we get our data from handfuls of partners, some direct application, all the way through aggregators like ourselves. So when there's time that we get conflicting metadata from the same essential ping, so the same lat long, the same device ID, on the back end, our system has to make a decision. Are we seeing this more often as not as an iOS device or an Android device? And so that device flipping is that decision-making criteria coming into there. Unfortunately, there could be a time or two where that is incorrect, and that's just an anomaly within the data. But it shouldn't be pervasive. And if you guys notice any additional anomalies within the data and you do find it, incredibly pervasive or limiting to you, please communicate those things back to Dewey. We really love feedback here at Veraset and work hard to enact on those pieces of feedback as well. And if you have any questions about any of the other data types that Veraset uses, Dewey could also route you over to us too.
Awesome. Very good. Anything you want to wrap on? I have a bunch of questions that have come through that I can kind of rapid fire at the team, but I'll pause for a second and let the Veraset team, if there's any last things you want to follow up on here quickly.
Start digging into the
That's it. We start take a few questions and wrap things
Right,
up
I'll do my best. I'm seeing some in the chat and the Q&A, so I'll jump around here a little bit and try to group them together. Let me see. So one thing, maybe let's do a little bit of like confirmation on the movement versus visits differences. I saw a couple questions around like confirming US based, which I know is true for visits. On the movement data, is there any international opportunities there?
Absolutely. So in short, we do offer movement data globally to roughly 200 countries, basically every country other than mainland China. We do have some data for Hong Kong and Russia, even though we do have a very small amount of data in Russia.
Awesome. And then to confirm too, if anyone has questions on the movement data, we'll definitely follow, like on the follow-up email, we can get you in touch with the Veraset team. The movement data, I think I clarified at the onset, but for those who weren't here, is not included with the Dewey subscription, but then the visits data is included with our institutional licenses. Let's talk a little bit around the minimum dwell time question came up again. Or I know you flagged like the negatives is definitely like some anomaly, very minuscule, but just in terms of how that's actually like kind of calculated, if it might not be obvious, but I'm just kind of curious to understand, is it just seeing like what are the maximum like distance between like two pings in a POI, or how do you kind of typically think about calculating that for a given visit to a POI?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So for a given device, if it's pinging multiple times within the same POI, then we're going to just take the start time and the end time and we're going to calculate a minimum dwell. Or it might be that there are several pings in that series and we might only cluster a few of them as part of the visit. And so perhaps it's the start time and one of the start times of the future pings. But in general, yeah, it's just that kind of calculation. And why you might sometimes see 0.0, in other words, a single ping visit, is exactly due to the factors that Danica was describing earlier, where earlier we had a multi-ping threshold, and now we're looking towards the clustering as a stronger signal of the validity of that visit.
Cool. And then staying on the topic of like kind of attribution and actually the visit itself, how do we think about shared polygons? I know that's a concept that's in the SafeGraph data, the SafeGraph places data, in terms of like overlapping or shared or even fully encased polygons. How does that represent itself in visits? If you have a shared polygon, are you attributing visits to both or picking one? Or yeah, just let's walk through that.
Adam, do you have any insight there?
Yeah, so in the case of a shared polygon, that's mostly going to happen, let's say, like in a mall kind of structure where you've got a parent polygon, which is a mall, and then you've got child polygons, which are all of the smaller stores. In general, we have the capability of tagging those sort of like child visits, and that'll work and it'll ping within the larger visit as well. Where that gets somewhat challenging is actually connected to one of the questions in the chat, which is the healthcare. So
Mhm.
the individual in the chat asked, what the 62 is healthcare. What happens to the food court in the hospital? The answer is it gets filtered out. And sometimes, and this depends on our polygon set, sometimes the child polygon will be coded as medical. Think something benign that you might find in a mall, like a lens crafters, which is still healthcare. And that sometimes that child polygon, that parent polygon get looped. And so what you'll experience is a black hole of visits in that particular location. That is a known issue. It is a thorny issue to stay in compliance. And we are actively exploring solutions where we can bring as much precision as possible while still staying on the right side of privacy and compliance.
Makes sense. And then in terms of like I mean, this is related to like the underlying movement data. Like, how do you think, or maybe just help us understand the accuracy of a given ping? Like, are all pings equal, or are there going to be different qualities of the panels and things like that? So how do we think about the ping and its potential accuracy, and then maybe the implication on something like a visits panel?
Yeah, I can jump in a little bit here,
Yeah.
guys. So to bring itself into the visits algorithm, it has to have 4 decimal places in that raw ping, that lat long. Both of them have to have at least 4 places after the decimal. The exact number at the moment in terms of what that size is escapes me, but it will be, we wouldn't allow less precise pings to be brought into the visits clustering algorithm to then attribute into a visit. So I can get back to you on what that 4th decimal like size wise would be in terms of the actual horizontal accuracy, whether it's probably feet, to be honest, maybe inches, but it should be fairly accurate. We do not allow less accurate, less precise data points within the clustering algorithm.
Yeah, I think even if one lat or long has 4, the other
It's missed
value
out.
has to have 5 or more. So like that. But 4 decimal places is inside of 10 meters, 5 decimal places inside of 1 meter. Just give you a sense of how precise it may be.
Cool. I'm seeing a couple questions related to like joining this data set to others, and then also inferring things like demographics. So I think I have a good maybe answer here, but I'll throw it to the Veraset team first to talk about how you would potentially kind of like, obviously you don't have the demographic information of the individual, but what are opportunities to maybe infer that based on, you know, some other data?
Let's take a stab at it. So short answer is we actually do have some demographic information going forward. We're actually launching that very shortly. We've been working diligently. The product team has been working to join a couple different ID spines, ID graphs, and various sources of the demographic data. So while it won't necessarily be valuable for historical data that Dewey receives, the data going forward, we would have available outside of Dewey to contract for. So there is that aspect. It won't be 100% match rate, but it should be pretty significant. So that's on the demographic side. What was the other? Another piece of that question.
That's awesome to hear you guys are working on that. The other thing I've seen is knowing, because you do have the like home census block group of the device. I think I've seen a lot of folks kind of join to the census data of the like, you know, device's home census block group to like infer general demographics. But obviously it's maybe not as accurate as the panel it sounds like you're putting together. The second one was around spend. So there's two questions. One, like directly just ask, can you join to SafeGraph spend? The other was more about, can you see the consumption of an individual once they visit a store? I think those are potentially a similar answer, where I know on the SafeGraph side, because they also are using their own POI layer, you can join on that place key attribute, which is an easier way to join versus like an address, because it's a unique identifier for an address. So just from what I know on the data sets provided by SafeGraph, which is an aggregating spend patterns data set, you can see things like the total spend at a store that a Veraset visit happens at. You're not going to see with that specific data set though, like exactly what they bought or an individual like SKU level item in that case. But it is joinable to any of the other data sets on our platform. And I think we have maybe 5 or 6 or more today that have that place key attribute pre-joined.
Nice.
So this data set will be able to be joined against that. Right. Cool. I guess any thoughts? One question came up around data sourcing. Pete, I'll probably point to you on this in terms of like, how do you think about your panel and how it might be different from, you know, other players in the space or competitors, things like that?
Yeah. So oddly enough, we should have several million more devices coming to visits very shortly, but we do know that we have some proprietary data within visits specifically to Veraset. We know of a couple suppliers that not only are incredibly dense data sets with a few million devices in the US, pinging 200 plus times a day, right? That are proprietary or unique to our visits product. So there are the moat, I guess you can say, of Veraset is our data suppliers, right? Our uniqueness and our ability to have exclusive supply with some of those suppliers. Of course, there's exclusive supply all over, right? So each individual company producing a visits-like product, that would be their IP is the underlying data and the supply. But what makes us unique, I would say, is the clustering algorithm, some of the machine learning, the historical aspect, as well as the ability to easily join other data sets like movement, home and work, conveyance, or even ham or match link HTML to this very easily.
One question I see here, and then we've also received for some of our other providers too, is this concept of like, you know, obviously your panel it's a panel, so it's a subset of the total like population engagement. Is there any suggestions or normalization capabilities to kind of like calculate an actual as close as possible in terms of like assuming, you know, what was the actual number of visits to a given POI given what you see in your panel?
Yes, we are releasing a new version of visits soon that introduces extrapolated and normalized visits counts, designed specifically to support trending analysis at the point of interest level. It's not going to necessarily include individual device weightings, and so it'll probably be more part of our aggregated offerings, which are offered via API. But there's definitely something we could explore, potentially providing like supplementary data sets to what we're providing in visits. But it's definitely something that we've been working on because, again, in addition to the opportunistic nature of the collection, there are also issues like human error around suppliers that we are either adding or taking out of our feed because of what we notice in terms of quality, or adding because Pete adds a new partnership to our portfolio. So we are definitely looking at normalizing and extrapolating, but at this moment in time, our flat file delivery doesn't include that.
Cool. Jumping around a bit more, kind of going back to the home and work files. A question was brought up to say it looks like potentially there's more CAIDs associated with home locations versus work locations. So it might be like based on how that's calculated and not being able to identify a work location if it's moving around or changing a bunch or something like that as a guess, but I'd like to maybe get an answer at that. And then similarly, I think it was answered earlier, but this concept of what if someone, has multiple work locations or that's changing regularly? Like, how is that represented in the panel?
Honestly, probably isn't. That's a tough one. That's a real tough one. I mean, it's definitely fairly binary. It's like, can find that thing called work in that. Like, you could also say, how about folks who work, untraditional hours? It will probably, like, we are applying a specific bias in order to get this kind of this inferred output. So yes, it won't be able to track multiple work locations or hybrid work. It'll probably work from home. It can do if the device is spending all of its time in that single location.
Yeah, it's also a symptom of the collection of data, right? It's opportunistically collected. It's not like there's pings firing in the back end all day, every day of these devices. And the ping frequency at which they're thrown, right, from an individual app or SDK varies greatly, whether it's on open every couple minutes, whether it's an SDK just pinging it on a timeline. So the collection frequency and the collection method dramatically affects the home and work locations and visits in general.
Right. So it sounds like too, like if the inputs don't signal a solid, strong output, there is a chance that you're just not going to map that CAID to a work location if it doesn't hit some threshold of accuracy. Got it.
Yeah. And to set expectations, there are many more devices in our visits data set than there are home and work, for sure.
Yeah, right. And then specific question here around, we talked about some NAICS filtering, anything related to like military bases, agencies, national security related sites, etc.
No, not currently. There has not been clear and concise language regarding those locations, although, I think that in the future that could become the case.
Yeah. And who knows if those are even in the SafeGraph POI data too, really. So
that's also another part of it, right? How pervasive are those even showing up in there as well? I'm sure that they have their own security networks and things like that, keeping that data as limited as possible.
Yeah, cool. I think I'll end on one more. I know we're getting kind of over on time here, and we can obviously follow up with any additional questions. Last question, I think it's kind of come up around like the refreshing of these IDs over time and kind of the longitudinal nature of an individual device in the panel. I'm sure, obviously the answer is it depends, right? You're going to have some that are in the panel for short time versus long time. But maybe a quick answer on how do you think about like how long a device could potentially, last in the panel?
Great question. So panel churn, right, in ad tech is an issue. We often see churn upwards of 15% month over month potentially and this could be a symptom of Apple and Google rotating IDs, but it absolutely is an issue. That's why the data is refreshed on a monthly, if not daily basis, right, to understand who these devices belong to and what kind of demographic data is tied to them. One way that I've seen customers kind of try to leapfrog this is also pairing this with HEM and understanding what HEM can do with these identifiers. If you have a specific CAID that's rotating or multiple CAIDs, or we even have a Vader product that rolls up all these MAIDs into a specific identifier. There's ways around it. it's incredibly difficult to track and to have a exact answer here, but there is panel churn, there is device churn month over month. That's going to happen.
Awesome. Well, I think we'll wrap it there with the questions. To the Veraset team, thank you so much. Just from a partnership point of view, I've loved how much you guys have leaned in to support academics, not only with Dewey, but in your own endeavors. So I'll say a big thank you from everyone who's attended too, because, you know, we love when data vendors are willing to support academic research, and you guys have done a ton to do that. So thank you from Dewey. Thank you from everyone who attended, and thank you to everyone who attended for the great questions. As we've said a couple times, we'll certainly follow up, and you're welcome to respond to that email for any introductions or follow-up questions, and we'll make sure to get you squared away. But with that, we'll wrap it there and send everyone off to enjoy the rest of their day. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much for
Thanks,
hosting.
guys.
Bye.